here is using our service virtualization? If you're okay raising your hands and sharing, okay, who you are, perfect. And then I want to ask, like, what are your primary use cases? I think we've heard from already some primary use cases, right? But do you do functional testing, performance testing? Are you looking at mainframe backend systems? Are you doing a variety? I just wanted to share kind of common use cases, and I think we've kind of covered them, so we'll keep going. And again, it's around what are we trying to achieve, right? So eliminating those constraints so that we can move quickly. It can really help you decouple your environment. So this means that I can, one, I have an end-to-end environment or test, right? If you're thinking of performance tests, but I don't have to necessarily wait till all of the things that are going to be released into production are available to do that end-to-end performance test. I can make sure I would be developing a microservice and it has an SLA or SLO ID to meet, right? How can that service be tested? I could have a decoupled environment where it helps supported by virtual services, right? As part of my flow or process. Do a performance test. Now I don't have to bring up all this expensive infrastructure either to support it, right? You have huge infrastructure savings. I can ensure that it meets it before it moves on, right? To the next spot, right? I'm sure there's going to be another performance test done. But at this point, right, my development team is confident that it should meet all the expectations, right? I don't have to worry when that performance test if it doesn't go the way I would expect. Right? Now I have to figure out all the different components it could be. And every team always says, it's not my problem. It's, well, look at that. It's not my problem. Look at that. Right? No one is like, hey, oh, yep, that was me. Right? And so it takes a lot of debugging, and this can help you decouple that. Right? And then you also have the multiple scenarios. There are situations where it's hard to get the reproduction of the environment that you need. Right? So maybe I want to test network delays. Right? I need to make sure I behave that way. Maybe I want to test air conditions. I want to test data coming back out of order. I want to test all these different kinds of scenarios. You can build in whatever scenarios you need to test. And we also integrate with TDM. So if you want to embed the right kind of data so that it can dynamically respond with the right kind of data, you can do that, right? So you can expand those data conditions. So here's the exciting part, right? Now that we're all aligned, where are we going, right? What's the first thing I'm going to highlight, and I think folks may know this already, but are themes. And these themes overall aren't changing, although I would say you have a new track on AI, but we're going to spend some dedicated time on AI. So it's for that reason, I do not add it as a theme, although it's definitely a track. But if you look at the themes of what's driving us, the first is around CI/CD and automation. Is how do we align so that the developers don't have to either leave their IDE, or so that things can be integrated completely across pipeline, or you can do things through APIs and self-service, right? How do we go end to end where you're not even going through like a UI, right? In order to be able to create your virtual services. The second has to do with our container support. Getting the benefits of OpenShift and Kubernetes. This will be our next release. We're going to dig into this quite a bit in the SV session, but we're going to have the ability to we already have simplified our containers significantly in 10.8. So if you haven't seen our 10.8 containers, familiar with some of the older versions of our containers, much simpler. We had a unified Helm. So as you go from one environment to another, right, you just change, right? Is it the private cloud, or am I using GCP or AWS, right? I just have to make and then some of them have their own configurations, right? But I just add those configurations in. But I don't have to have different kinds of YAML files for different kinds of environments. I've also made it so much easier to have all my components all in one, right? There's a lot of things we've done. SSL, right? Much simpler. There's only a few properties to set up. If you're used to our on-prem, it's much simpler than that, right? Very easy to get set up and running. The next thing you'll see, and we'll talk about this as well, is the scalability, right? So how can I get my VSC itself to scale? And then enterprise management, right? We continue to look at how do we get the data you need to understand how is the capabilities being consumed? How do we make upgrades simpler? How do we continue to make it so that it can scale? All the enterprise management is top of our mind as well. So those are kind of the themes guiding us. So then you're like, okay, that's nice, those themes. What does that actually mean? So let's talk about the capabilities. Okay, so we'll start with 10.8. 10.8 has a lot of capabilities. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I think there's, again, these themes. API enhancements, right? We have a lot of different API enhancements in our V3 API to make things simpler. I'm sure you can see there's just comma, right? Because there's a lot of things that we could do. But we're focused on how can you do more with more complexity. So for example, I talked about one of the options is data-driven, right? So if a virtual service is referencing, for example, an external file, a CVS or a CSV file, right? And determining based on the data what to mesh and how to formulate those socks, right? You can actually end-to-end create a data-driven virtual service. So engineering has a spec. That spec is not going to have all the data it needs, right? So from that spec, maybe they've updated their spec because they made some sort of change. So as part of their pipeline, that could kick off. It creates a virtual service in a single call. From there, it looks up, right, how to, like that transaction ID, and then it maps it to the external file. And if the external file is the same argument names as the columns, then it will automatically map that as well, right? So it can basically create the mapping it needs, and you could bring up a data-driven virtual service. Now the data changes. Maybe the spec hasn't changed, but the data changes. I can do another single API call, change out the data, right? So lots that can be done automatically with our APIs. We talked a little bit about the container support. We're going to dig into that coming up as well. And then we have a lot of usability enhancements, whether that's going to be expanding data protocols, whether that's going to be kind of our native header maps that talk about that in minutes, whether that's being able to use like the logs to better understand why something may not have matched, right? We have added a lot of capabilities in order to support that. And then if you look in the future, what's coming up next is 10.9. And 10.9 is just around the corner. It is later this fall, it is this year, right? So we're excited about 10.9. 10.9 has a number of capabilities in it. The biggest one that I'm like very excited to share with you, and we're gonna dig into that more with Sachin and when we split up, is our native auto scaling. So that same virtual service environment can replicate. So no more do I have to worry about if I need multiple virtual service environments to meet my load standards. I'm not setting up multiple services in load balancing. It will take care of that load balancing. It will also allow for you to potentially be more thoughtful about some of the infrastructure use. If I have some infrastructure that is really large because during the performance tests I need it, and maybe it's being utilized 80% of the time. Maybe it's really heavy, but it's still not 100% of the time. That's 20% of the time you don't need that big of infrastructure, right? So you get the advantage of native Kubernetes. There's a lot of advantages there. And so that's going to have the support of the VSE scaling up and down, right? We're continuing to expand our APIs, and you'll continue to see this. We have introduced as well with the Kafka. So our current APIs support HTTP, HTTPS. We're expanding the protocol. So if you have the input files, right, we can support JMS and MQ. If you have request response pairs, you can also support Kafka. I believe we're going to have time to show that as well. And then we have some other enhancements. I think we'll talk about those in a minute. So let me move on. I'm going to share maybe a couple of different features, and then we'll move on, right? So the first is the native header match. This is in 10.8, right? So if there's something in the header I want to match on, right? Maybe I'm passing an account ID in a call. I want to match on that. Previously, there were other ways to address it, but we've now introduced a way to natively say, in addition to my arguments, this header is important to me. I can either check it in our workstation, I can pass it as in our sidecars for our APIs, and it will automatically do that. And what's nice is I don't have to have any other logic. When the transaction comes in, it will check that header and it will match. and it will be able to bring it back. Now, we have different types of matches. So we have if it's an exact match or if it's a meta match, right? So where we would look at whether is it present or are the values there, right? And so it behaves the same way, right? If I'm checking for values, the values need to match. So it's an exact kind of match, or if it's a signature or meta match, I'm saying I want this response regardless of whether or not the values match, right? And it will work the same way. We also are going to allow you to enforce the naming convention of virtual services. So I could define, most organizations have a naming convention, right? It might be a 4 or 5 parts that helps me understand who's using it, what application, what version of the application, right? There's a common sort of naming convention that if anyone were to read the service, they know what it's for, right? I know whether it's a payment to something, like I know what system, I know what it's for, right? I can define that naming convention in my site.properties of what it should be. You have the flexibility to configure your own error message as well, right? If I'm talking about teams, some people say teams, some people will say, like, I don't know if they're dev groups or if they're pods or they're agile teams or whatever it is. You can use your own language, right, to define what the error message should be if it's not correct, right? So you can define as a regular expression how it should behave. You can define when it doesn't meet that, and we can make sure that that naming convention is enforced. That you cannot, whether it's the APIs, I showed it in a UI because it's just easier, right? Whether it's a UI or API, if you don't meet it, you can't create it. We talked about Kafka as well, but we're really excited. We're going to add more protocols and more protocols. You're going to continue to see some excitements, right? Kafka is, available as either a patch on top of our 10.8 or it'll be native in 10.9. And you'll see more and more capabilities, not just protocols, but things around scripting, some of the most common baby steps that you might be using, right? We're going to continue. We talked also about deleting to some people, right? You're going to see more and more capabilities added in the APIs. And then if you are using like our, messaging protocols and other things, you're using our assets, right? They're defining your queues and the information. You might be, defining, what topics and things you're listening to for like Kafka. So we've added an easier way within the workstation to be able to see it. So before we would just have that kind of tree view on the left-hand side, right? And now we have more of a table view. You can switch between, but the table view is nice, right? You can see when something's been changed. Maybe I made a recent change. Maybe I forgot to rename it, right? Like I can see which version it is. I can, sort, I can search, I can do a bunch of other things in order to more easily identify the right assets. And then we've also extended in the 10.9, you're going to see extended SSO, right? So if you are utilizing our SSO or want to, right, having it extended across the product. So all the capabilities, including the workstations, the SSO will work with. So I'm going to pause there. We're going to talk about kind of all together across the different products, which is why I sort of separated it out. But it is also, I'm sure, on your mind and on ours, right? And it is a track that you could think of as a theme of what we're doing. But any questions around kind of the direction for SB? Yes.
Earlier on this slide, is the SSO capability just for the workstation, and can it work across all the other boards?
Yes, it will work across the other portals as well. Yes.
Beverly, can you repeat the question?
So the question was on SSO, right? It's saying, is it only going to work with Virtual Service Catalog and also Workstation? And so SSO previously had only been available for the portal UIs, right? So Enterprise Dashboard, IAM, and like the portal, right? And so this is extending it so that it works across the board, right? So you're authenticating, there you go, right?
So is there any demo scheduled for after Judge?
Yes, so Satch is waiting. When we do the Slick group, we're gonna dive into that feature. So in 10.8, we introduced a new learning mode. So for those unfamiliar with our learning modes, we have different execution modes that allow you to determine, for example, when a service or virtual service should respond. So sometimes a virtual service can respond all the time, right? But sometimes it might only respond if the live system is down. then the virtual service responds. And sometimes it will respond, but if it doesn't have a response, it will send it to that target system, get the response, and then send it, right? There's different ways that you can configure it, right? It's quite extensible. So one of those modes is our learning mode, which is, hey, I want you to actually go to the system of record, right? There's been updates. I want you to learn these transactions and add it into what you know and respond to. The disadvantage of the initial learning mode is if that target system goes down, it's going to override and learn these error conditions. So the new learning mode will check the target system and it will get the transaction. But if it's an error condition, right, it's a 400 or 500, it's not going to learn an app, right? Our regular learning mode though. But so if you want that error condition, you can still get it, right? But our newer learning mode will not. And on top of that, if the virtual service has a response, it will provide it back. And I hope this also helped provide some where we're going, right? Not just in the short term, but like I said, the APIs is really going to be an area you're going to see a lot more. We are also looking at adding some additional protocol support with GraphQL being close to come as well. And again, I'm going to provide a little context that I think we sort of understand a little bit more about our test data manager. But the mission of what we're trying to do is really important to us, right? We want to make sure we can deliver that secure data at scale via self-service, right? Across all your different data types, right? Distributed, mainframe, SQL, NoSQL, right? We want to be able to support all the different kinds of data types that you might have and all the different data sources. Obviously, security is important, right? You want to make sure that you're not exposing any data that shouldn't be exposed, right? So, masking, we provide and follow best practices. We use NIST standards, right? We eliminate that need to, if you need to not correlate back to that production system to be able to synthetically generate the data. We expose self-service. So first of all, anything that you can do in the TDM portal has an API call behind it, right? Everything is exposed as APIs, so there's nothing that you can't do in the UI that you can't expose and do as part of your end-to-end processes. But we also have the concept of a self-service portal that your users can go and do and augment, right? And so this is to ensure that you can both stay compliant, but also have the data that you need quickly. So we have some, I'm going to talk about 4.11. This is our current release. And 4.12, right, 4.11 plus, right? But it's really 4.12 is coming out expected early next year, right? It's around the corner, but it's not likely this year. It's right after this year, right, is what we're looking at. So 4.11 has a lot of different capabilities. We also have themes, right, of what we're trying to do, focused on both usability, scalability, and native NoSQL support. So when we think about native NoSQL support, we've actually expanded the data sources that we support. So Cassandra, MongoDB, BigQuery, right, we've expanded, and you'll see we continue to expand data support. We also look at things like the usability. So having a flow that allows you to, for example, show your auditors, here is how we are corrected, right? Not only do we have this covered, but we have the evidence of what we've done to remediate. That same flow can then be used in order to make sure I'm actually doing the masking, right? I'm not having to do separate work, right? So how do I integrate end-to-end and simplify my processes, right? Then here's some other capabilities as well. A big other capability has to do with the auto scale, right? How can I make sure that my job's finished quickly? So if I'm trying to, think earlier we had an example, right, where you're saying, I went ahead and we've masked an entire system, right, that we had for, end-to-end, right? It wasn't a subset, it was a part of it, it was the whole thing. Right? So when I have really large jobs, I might have terabytes of data, right? How can I do that in a couple of hours, right? Not a couple of days, right? We don't want people wait. And that's allowing you to do things, being able to scale up, scale down, so that you're only using the resources when you need them, but I can do so at scale quickly. So those are the capabilities that we have in 4.11. In 4.12, we have a few different capabilities. The first is data assisted for synthetic data generation. And I think I'm going to cover that. I think most of these I'm going to cover in more depth. There's a few things that you'll see some performance enhancements, especially around Snowflake. You'll see additional database and support and more capabilities added to the portal. But I'm going to cover, I think, Data Assistant a little bit more, and Dave, or Database Virtualization Engine, as well, a little bit more. So those are coming out soon. So I talked about this auto scaling, right? But it's really an advantage, right, to be able to auto scale. And it is a unique advantage to our solution to be able to do that. And so we are able, as the job starts, to bring up more and more containers to handle the job, to be able to get through that process quickly. And as the job is completing, bring them back down, right? So similar to, we're talking about scalable VSC, we're actually using a similar type framework with TDM today, right, to be able to do that. And then, obviously, there's other advantages, right? Being able to keep things upgraded and on the latest version, and managing your overall intent environment becomes a little bit easier. I also talked about the unified PII scan fast audit, right? But before, they were kind of separate flows or systems, right? And now the same results, right? If I go through the scan and I see what I need to remediate, that's going to be the same thing that I then need to kind of mask or address or remediate and so on, right? So as I get the sign off, right, you may have some folks actually have to go through an official audit process. I've reviewed, right, this data. It's identified this is PII. Someone externally, like or in your organization, right, says, yes, this is PII. We have identified it. And then you have to remediate it, right? But that whole flow end to end is documented. It cannot be changed. So that if an auditor comes and says, what are you doing? You just have to pull up the report. Yes, we've identified it. Yes, we've signed off on it. And yes, we've remediated it. And you've got all of that documented end to end. And the flow is the same. So Data Assistant, and we are going to dig into this again a little bit more when we separate into groups. So if you want to see more about how Data Assistant works, you can. But this is to make it easier to identify the synthetic data generation rules, right? So if I'm trying to generate data synthetically, I want to easily pre-identify as much as I can. And I may have to modify some things, but I want, and their goal is 90 to 95% accuracy of identifying all the synthetic data generation rules, and even some cloning rules. Maybe there's some things that you can just copy over that aren't PII or other kinds of data. Maybe I want to just simplify that. And other things are, and maybe don't want to mask, or I want to be able to synthetically generate that data, right? Being able to determine that based on previous scans and tagging and templates and other ways to identify that with accuracy, so you're not having to determine what is it that I need to put in for the synthetic data generation rule, right? We will automatically do that for you, and then you can modify if need be. So you have the flexibility to, change it. There may be some unique situations for, like, everyone has their own unique some data situations. So that is our Data Assistant. It's really exciting, and it's not done, right? The capability to get to maybe 90, 95% might be done, but we want to get even back, right? So the capabilities within the Data Assistant, you're going to see more and more advanced capabilities there as well, right, in the future. So we'll talk about what's today, and then there's going to be more tomorrow. And then also with our upcoming 4.12, we're kind of calling it DAVE, our Database Virtualization Engine, right? And we're going to expand our capabilities into data virtualization. So is anyone familiar with what that is? Database virtualization. It's similar to VTDM. Do you want to, how would you describe VTDM?
They keep get the database and we have put it smaller.
Very nice. So it's how do I make, so for example, each team or group may want to have their own sort of copy of the data, right? They may have to make some modifications to it, but I don't want to have the storage costs and effort and time in order to do that, right? So it allows me to expand how many clones or copies that I have without increasing the storage in any meaningful way, and allow for that speed, right? So that is the capability with our database virtualization. This, I would say, is kind of anything you may have seen in the past is not at all comparable to the kind of speed and performance and automation that you're going to get with Dave, right? So I think, I know you referenced something that previous, but think of this as a new capability in our portfolios.
So at the moment, we support three different types of databases. So you will be able to, let's say, virtualize those three different types and then clone them and be able to use them. So if you're referring, let's say, if you have a database, specific database on a SaaS platform, yeah, is it what you're referring to? So what we are supporting now is MongoDB, Oracle, and DB. So if any of these are sort of is what you reference to, then we would be able to do that for you.
Suppose that's in your
It is on the right mic. So if, let's say, for Progress, if when we support it, then we will be able to inject that database into our Dave, be able to use it within Dave and clone it.
what we want.
So let's say you have that global version, yeah. You will have access to, let's say, a connection string, and so you have so you use that connection string to use it against your application wherever it is. So it is an instance, a database instance. It is a clone, but it is a database instance that you can use wherever you
Here by facilities that people like Salesforce without experience. Some of these have their own higher good specific data providers or the company specific masking was that. And they pay not allow to get they will have that.
yeah, that's maybe Beverly's realm, but I'm sure that we are planning to let's say expand, like you said with Salesforce, but take it Beverly.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting direction. We're aware, right? Like that could be something of value. So it is something we'll look into and explore.
Like we are iPads, so yes, iPads. So they work in other providers. So yeah, that's
Yeah, it's definitely an interest area, right? I think it's not, first, we're going to have the capability, but yes, there's definitely a lot of ways we can expand. There's a few different ways that we already have designed that obviously share what she. There's also data sources, but there's also capabilities. So I think I actually thought I had one more slide. Let me double check, because this is another area in which we are going, but yes, I've another theme around the line. So there's a number of different things we're looking at. And apologies if I don't see you raise your hand, let me know. There is a bright light for anyone who's been on the stage. But we also are looking at, with capabilities like this, being able to do things like delta masking, right? So this is something that is in flight as well, right? So rather than being able to, every time there's a change, having to replicate and mask the whole entire system, identifying that quickly and just masking that change, right? So there's a lot of capabilities that are really opening up in terms of the capabilities of what you're going to see in our TDM solutions. So we're excited to share those with you. And there's a lot of exciting innovations. So with that, I think, any more questions on, yes?
you talked about learning periods, right? You also talked about not increasing storage additionally. How does it go?
Yeah, so I think we can provide. So, Donovan, do you want to share a little bit more about the infrastructure in terms of how we're going to be able to not increase the storage, and it's basically high level. Or you? Oh, I'm jumping in. Go, Donovan. You can go.
Yeah, it's based on the term of operating system. So what happens is that when it creates flow, so the cloud will be based on the original database. So we call it a base image. So you have a base image, yeah, the initial ingestion of the source database, yeah. So we have, and then when you create a clone, the clone will reference the base image, okay? So, and any delta differences will be the one that the clone will store in the disk. So if there is no change between the clone and the source or the base image, then there is no delta. So there is no storage. Okay. Yeah. So basically, it's lightweight. It's something like a view which you are doing it. It is like a view, but it's not because it is a private database. So if you have tested 10 testers, and each one has their own clause, you would be able to change the clause, their own private clause. So you would be able to change the database, and without affecting the old clause. But the storage will be the delta, that is the difference between the pre-sold one and the top. Okay.
Any other questions? Because if there are, we can just pass the mic.
Is this going to be a separate part of us, or is it going to be an extension of your video?
So it is an extension of our offering, but there is a database virtualization SKU associated with it. But I think some other people had this question, and you may have also, right? We can look at what your entitlements are. Some people already have kind of a consumption of whatever you need. Some may be participating in early validation, right? And that can kind of open up your opportunities as well, right? So if this is something where you're like, hey, I eagerly am interested, let us know. We can help you figure that out. Yep.
And another question is that once the clone is taken, if you have to refresh a day after maybe a month or so, how does that happen?
Yeah, so I'll let you go for it if you want, for I can.
So you have let's say you have the base image, yeah, and you say you create cloud of base image, and then let's say a month later you want you have a new refresh, yeah. You can ingest the new refresh into the base image, so you'll end up with two versions. So you would be able to reference the old version or the new versions, and if you want to to get rid of the old one, you can do so. So you can still use both the old version and the new version independently.
And there's reasons to sometimes keep the old version. Say maybe my production system might still be on that older version. Maybe if I'm trying to replicate something that happens, right, and I'm trying to replicate an air condition, right, I might want to still keep an older version, right? Maybe production has moved on and I can go ahead and get rid of it, right? So there's some flexibility there. Any other questions?
No, that's it. So currently, all the support mask documents, the user have the password to there is so much bursts to the most yeah.
Yep. That is something on the plan to expand the support for, like you said, like BDS and lookings. Yeah.
And part of the identification there is in line with some of the AI capabilities that we're working on as well. And so that does also include looking at those expanded data sources. But you're right. I don't have enough time to cover each product roadmap in entirety and sort of taking segments of it just from the time perspective. How am I doing on time? Am I over time?
A little bit.
Okay, so we're gonna move on. Oh, a minute or so. So I'm close. We're gonna move on. We will have dedicated sessions for SV and TDM. I know we had a little bit of a highlight of continuous delivery director, but I just wanted to see this. I want to make sure we understand kind of what does it do, right? And really, it's a powerful pipeline orchestration and analytics solution to make sure that I can release applications end to end. And it integrates, right, via like plugins and APIs and other things with any of the systems that you need, right, in your end-to-end flow or process. It's not meant to replace what a developer wants to do in a CI flow or process, right? It's meant to provide that added visibility and orchestration, right? It also has the governance that I need, right? A developer might be able to push whatever they want into a development environment, right? Maybe they can push into the next environment too. Maybe they can't, right? Maybe I only want 1 or 2 people or whatever to be able to take everything and push it into production, right? You can have the overall governance and control as well into your end-to-end process. You can even embed testing requirements as well, right? It could create your virtual services. It could integrate with the data that it needs for that environment before it runs the test. It can prioritize which test should run first, right? Because my goal is, if I'm testing an application, if it's going to fail, I want to know now. I don't want to wait X minutes, hours, whatever, right? I want the prioritized tests that are most important to me to tell me if my system's going to fail so that I know it and I can correct it, right? So that's what CED is designed to help us do, right? Do you want to add anything as well? No? Okay. So we're going to also take a minute, and I think we're going to have to switch back and forth, right? So get your computer ready, Sachin. Because we're going to talk a little bit more about release tracks. So in this, we're going to take a minute and talk about release tracks. So this is a capability your product team or you may only give you, or your release team may give you certain windows, right? Maybe every week or every 2 weeks or every month there's a release, right? And there's only a certain window. And as applications are changing, right, they can say, it's past all of their testing and subscribing that I'm ready to release in window A. I want to release in window B, right? I identify what milestone to release I want to be able to do, right? And now I'm able to orchestrate the entire deployment. Maybe there's certain applications that have dependencies, and they can only release, but they need to make sure that all these other pieces are pulled in with that, right? Making sure that I can visualize and know what those dependencies are. Maybe there are certain applications that have to go in certain order. Maybe other things can go all at once, right? Being able to use release tracks allows you to orchestrate the entire release end to end and have those synchronized releases, have that consistency, and make sure you also have that end-to-end visibility, right? What is subscribed in there and has it met all the standards? Are there any dependencies that aren't accounted for, right? Making sure is it orchestrated in a way that it's going to be most effective, most efficient, and fastest, and automated, right? And so that you're not having to manually manage that.